Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Happy Wednesday to all of our listeners. What a whirlwind of a 24 hours it has been. The Seahawks and the rest of the NFL had to turn in their final 53-man roster by 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time yesterday. Of course, the Seahawks are one of the last teams that released their final 53 and the players that they had released and cut. That was to be expected. That seems like that is an annual tradition for the Seahawks, whether there's COVID or not. They are always one of the last teams that reveals which players made it and which players, unfortunately, were on the wrong side of the bubble. So I'll be breaking down that initial 53-man roster that has already had a few changes to it in the last 24 hours since they released that initial roster. I'll be breaking down some thoughts from that in the second quarter, and a special guest will be joining the show in the third quarter to share his thoughts on expectations for Russell Wilson and the Seahawks heading into the 2021 season. Without further ado, let's get rolling. The NFL season is about to begin, and nobody covers it like the Locked On Podcast Network. August 30th through September 8th, Locked On's Ultimate Season Preview is taking you through every team in every division with the help of Odyssey's Ross Tucker and Jason Lockenfora. Follow the Ultimate Season Preview 2021 feed in the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast to tune in beginning August 30th. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. It was a really busy day at the VMAC for the Seahawks front office and their coaching staff yesterday as they had to trim the roster from 80 players down to 53 before the 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time deadline. Ultimately, Seattle ended up releasing 3 vested veterans, Robert Nkemdiche, Jordan Simmons, and Damarius Randall, as well as waiving 26 players. Looking at those vested veterans first, really no real surprises among those 3. Robert Nkemdiche at the beginning of training camp, I thought had a very good chance of making Seattle's 53-man roster as long as he could stay healthy, and that did not happen. Unfortunately, he dealt with a groin injury that cost him the first 2 preseason games, and then he's dealing with another soft tissue injury that prevented him from suiting up in the 3rd preseason game. So this is a player that hadn't played since 2019 in an NFL game. He needed to be able to show out in game action to make this 53-man roster, and with him being unavailable, he was not able to do that. With that being said, the Seahawks are not giving up on him. He was one of the 14 players that was signed to their practice squad, so there may still be an opportunity for him once he can get healthy to be able to contribute on the active roster at some point for the Seahawks. As for Jordan Simmons, he was put in a difficult spot because of the depth the Seahawks have along the offensive line and the fact that he's really a guard only. He's not a center. He can't play the tackle spots. There are a number of players that have more versatility than him on the offensive line. He's also had some durability issues throughout his college and NFL football career. So that ended up making him a player on the outside looking in a little bit. But he might be another one that has an opportunity to come back to the practice squad. For now, nothing has happened on that front. And as for Damarius Randall, he also was dealing with injuries during training camp, and he missed a couple of preseason games. A veteran that has started more than 40 games in his NFL career, but just wasn't able to really build off of a strong start to training camp, was not able to do enough on the field, especially in game action, to win a roster spot, especially with how crazy things are at the cornerback position. They still haven't named starters. He just wasn't able to really stand out compared to the rest of the crowd. And so the Seahawks moved on. He is another player that maybe is a practice squad candidate, but also with him being almost 30 years old, the Seahawks might be looking at some other options that are younger to fill those 16 slots. Looking at the players that ended up coming back to the Seahawks today, I mentioned Robert Nkemdiche. I'm not going to read through the entire list of all the players that were waived, but the Seahawks brought back 14 players today on their practice squad, including linebacker Aaron Doncore. He is exempt from their normal 16-man limit because he is a rookie that came from the International Player Pathway program. So they can actually have 17 players on their practice squad this year with Doncor being there. He was going to be on this list no matter what. It's a free player on your practice squad, and he showed some promise late in the preseason, starting to figure things out a little bit. So exciting to see him on there, but they also added 13 other players to their practice squad that were all with the team during training camp, a number of undrafted rookies that they're excited about that weren't quite able to make the final roster, but now they'll be available to be promoted for game days off the practice squad, and it gives them some quality depth. So looking at the list, defensive tackle Miles Adams, as well as Aaron Doncore, as I mentioned, guard Grady Island, receivers Aaron Fuller and Penny Hart coming back in the practice squad, defensive tackle Jared Hewitt, another receiver in Cade Johnson, running back Josh Johnson, guard Pierre-Olivier Lestage, tight end Tyler Mabry, Robert Kimdiche, as I mentioned earlier, John Reed, the corner they traded for last week. They're bringing him back in the practice squad, as well as linebacker John Radigan, and one more receiver in Cody Thompson. I'll be talking about this a little bit more in the second quarter, but there's a reason there are so many receivers on this practice squad. But there are a couple of undrafted players on this list in particular that Seahawks fans should be really excited that the team was able to retain. I think that, as I mentioned, Aaron Doncore is a player that late in the preseason, you started to see him flash a little bit playing the strong side linebacker position, because that's really where he's best suited, when he can rush off the edge. So it's good to have him back. John Radigan looked really good in that final preseason game. He's a player the Seahawks are very excited about his potential to be able to contribute on game days down the road. Cade Johnson, the receiver, had kind of a quiet camp at times, but really he's a high upside player, put up big numbers at South Dakota State at college level, can run out of the slot. He's also got some special teams value as well. Putting him back with Aaron Fuller and Cody Thompson, Penny Hart as well, those four receivers, it gives the Seahawks a lot of flexibility when they go into game day, because I believe they can bring up players twice during the regular season at the practice squad. So they can mix and match those four receivers onto their active roster with the four players that ended up making the team. And it gives them a lot of roster flexibility. And up front, I still think Pierre-Olivier Lestage has a chance to be a potential center for them down the road. They're still listing him as a guard, but he has gotten some opportunities to snap the football at practice. A developmental player coming down from the University of Montreal, didn't play most of training camp because he was on the non-football injury list recovering from hernia surgery. But once he got back out in the field, he's made a positive impression on Seattle's coaching staff. So he is certainly a player that I would keep an eye on as well. Overall, this is a very solid-looking practice squad. A number of guys that could have made the 53-man roster, such as Penny Hart, who are still going to be practicing with the team. And again, it gives them a lot of flexibility. And if they make a few more roster moves, they could move a few of these players back up to the 53 before week 1 against the Colts. So again, a lot of flexibility, able to retain their players. And thank goodness that we now have 16-player practice squads, and that they decided to keep that along with the 3-week injured reserve. Those were very nice changes that came about during the COVID-19 pandemic. And teams like the Seahawks are going to continue to take advantage of those. Coming up in the second quarter, I'm going to take a look at 5 takeaways that stood out to me after reviewing the initial 53-man roster. There have been already a few changes that kind of go along with some of the stuff that I observed, but I'm going to be breaking down what I saw position by position on that 53-man roster. When I come back, you're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's that time of year again, and all eyes are now turning to football as teams are back on the gridiron to start the upcoming season. As always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. Get all the updated odds, props, and contests, including online's biggest $500,000 NFL mega contest and the world's largest $200,000 NFL Survivor contest, now on BetOnline. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 100% welcome bonus using the code LOCKEDON. Be sure to take advantage of their opening day super promo. Make a bet on Thursday, September 9th during the season opener between the Buccaneers and the Cowboys. If you lose, your wager will be refunded up to $25 for new customers only when signing up and using the promo code NFL100. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports, from football, basketball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the great offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Wednesday edition. This is your host, Corbin Smith. The Seahawks, like the rest of the NFL yesterday, had to trim their roster down from 80 players to 53 before the 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time deadline. As I mentioned in the first quarter, Seattle waived 26 players. They released 3 vested veterans. They made a few other moves as well. Looking at the 53-man roster, I'm not going to read through every single position group and just bore you guys with that. But instead, I want to talk about some observations that I made from this initial 53 and what to expect when the Seahawks play in Indianapolis. If you've followed John Schneider, and most of the general managers in the NFL are this way, he has always done a bunch of roster churning after the initial 53. There are normally several players that make that initial 53-man roster that aren't on the team when they play in week one. You have to consider waiver claims. The Seahawks made 2 of those today and were awarded. So that changes things. Of course, injured reserve. There are a number of different factors at play that alter what teams end up doing with their roster. The Seahawks are always turning over stones, looking for ways to fortify some of their weaker positions going into the regular season. And so I anticipate we're going to continue to see movement. The first big thing that I want to talk about is the quarterback situation, because you look at Seattle's history under Pete Carroll, with Russell Wilson being the Iron Man that he is. He's never missed a regular season or playoff start. He's never missed a start in his career. Backups have very rarely played. It's typically taken blowouts for them to get into games. There's only been one example where Russell Wilson got injured in a game and they had to put a backup in Trayvon Boykin in for him back in 2015. Otherwise, number 3 is under center. So they've never had to worry about having 3 quarterbacks on the roster because the second one very rarely plays. But Seattle actually kept Sean Mannion for 24 hours on their roster, and then reportedly they released him and signed Jake Luton, another Oregon State alumni who recently played for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And so right now, regardless of which one of those guys is on the roster, they have 3 quarterbacks on the roster. I don't expect that to be the way things are in week one. That is going to be a spot that ultimately is going to be filled by a player at another position. The Seahawks are not going to use a placeholder quarterback as on one of their 53-man roster spots. And if they're worried about insurance, it's going to be a player on practice squad. So what I anticipate is going to happen here is that Jake Luton, or if it's another quarterback, the way the roster churns, maybe somebody else will get brought in. But for now, Luton would be that number 3 quarterback coming over from Jacksonville. I would expect that the Seahawks are going to wait a few days, and then they're going to release him with hopes of signing him back to their practice squad. That way they have that insurance quarterback behind Russell Wilson and Geno Smith. But I don't see any way, given Wilson's lack of injury history, knock on wood, and the fact they've got a quality backup in Geno Smith, I don't see them keeping a third quarterback on their 53-man roster. So look for that to change in coming days. But for now, they still got 3 QBs. Another couple positions that I think we are going to see some changes before week one. The Seahawks kept all 5 of their top running backs, and maybe that'll hold true going into the regular season just because Seattle has had injury issues at that position for the last several years. They've got 5 totally different players with different skill sets that all bring different things to the table that can contribute for the Seahawks. You've got Chris Carson, Rashad Penny, DJ Dallas, Alex Collins, and Travis Homer. All of them bring different strengths to the table. A number of those players can play special teams as well. So they kept all 5 of those players. I've got to wonder if that's going to be the case by week one, however, because all it's going to take is a injury or 2 at other positions, and the Seahawks are going to have to move on from one of those running backs most likely to create a spot on the 53 at a couple of those other positions. So I would expect John Schneider is putting some flyers out there to a few teams that may need running back help. Maybe they've had a few injuries, and dangling players like DJ Dallas, Alex Collins, and Rashad Penny. I would expect Chris Carson is not going to be on that list because he's going to be the starter for the Seahawks, but Homer as well. I would think anybody not named Chris Carson, there might be an offer that the Seahawks would be willing to consider there just because they're not going to be playing all 5 of those running backs each week, and they could use a roster spot at another position. So I'm anticipating there's still going to be some movement at that spot. I feel the same way about the offensive line as well. The front line had 11 players coming out of the initial 53-man roster cut, including Jake Curran, the undrafted rookie out of California. As Rob Rang and I speculated, I actually thought that the Seahawks were going to cut him. Ultimately, they decided to keep him, though. He did enough during the preseason, played really well in his 3 starts at right tackle that they didn't want to risk losing him on the waiver wires. Pete Carroll mentioned today he outright earned that spot on the team. But there are some question marks there because they were able to get up to 12 players today, and then they released Phil Haynes. I'll talk a little bit more about that on our Thursday show when Rob Rang returns. But They've got 11 players still at the offensive line positional group. They normally have 9, 10 at the most on their roster for game days. And so I'm expecting another move or two there coming up here in the next several days going into the season. And that actually is a perfect segue for my third takeaway here. I think there's a really good chance that rather than just cutting players as they continue to do roster churning here going into week one, I think that there is a really good chance that you will see at least a player or two open the year on injured reserve. Now, if the Seahawks would have put players on injured reserve before the cut down deadline, they would have been out for the season. Ben Burkerve and John Ursua, obviously the two players that have already ended up on IR, they have torn ACLs. They weren't going to play this year anyway. But any other player that maybe has an injury that's only a few weeks long, you wanted to wait, keep them on the 53-man roster, and then you can put them on injured reserve, and they're out for a minimum of 3 weeks. There are a number of players that could be candidates for that, including on the offensive line. Cedric Ogbuehi is still dealing with a bicep issue that cost him the vast majority of training camp at all 3 preseason games. The Seahawks thought he was back. He practiced a few days for the preseason finale, but he has not practiced again this week. I think considering there's 11 offensive linemen right now, that would be an easy way to get that number down to 10 without cutting another player. Put Ogbuehi on injured reserve. He's going to miss a minimum of 3 weeks. And then maybe by that point, they will have a need for an offensive lineman. They can activate him. And that's the best part about having a shortened injured reserve, that every player can be put on that list during the season. You can activate them. Now, the second time you put them on IR, they're done for the season. But you don't have to worry about that with Ogbuehi. So I think that's a possibility. Tight end Colby Parkinson, no idea when he's going to be back. It sounds like he's making pretty good progress, but he is another player to keep an eye on that might go on IR. And then a player like Tyler Mabry that's on the practice squad could be elevated for a game or two until they wait to get Parkinson back in action. Rookie corner Trey Brown is another one that Pete Carroll said today there's no timetable for him coming back from a knee sprain. That might mean he's going to miss the first 3 games or so, and he could start an injured reserve. So any of those players, if they go on IR, that immediately opens up a roster spot that the Seahawks can use to bring somebody else on board. So I would expect that we're going to see that happen as well. A couple other observations I want to make here real quick at other positions. 4 receivers really isn't that odd for the Seahawks when you think about it. They actually late last year only had 4 receivers on the roster. Penny Hart got called back up to the 53 for their playoff game, but they were doing the promote from practice squad strategy late in the year. They were doing that with a number of players. And as I mentioned in the first quarter, when you look at the fact that Aaron Fuller, Cade Johnson, Penny Hart, and Cody Thompson are all on the practice squad, Pete Carroll hinted at this today. That's a lot of flexibility. That's 8 games total worth of players that you can move up to the game day roster without having them on the 53. And all 4 of those players are players that are capable of contributing on Sundays if needed. So it gives the Seahawks, as I've mentioned a number of times today, a lot of flexibility. And all 4 of those players offer some different skill sets to go with Freddie Swain, D. Eskridge, and of course the superstars, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So that's really not a big deal. If they go into week 1 with 4 receivers, I expect them, one of their 2 players they call up from the practice squad is going to be a receiver, probably a player like Penny Hart or Cody Thompson that can offer special team value. Really, all 4 of those players offer special teams value in some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of flexibility for the Seahawks. And the last position group that I expect we're going to see some significant changes between now and week 1, there's still the Geno Atkins situation looming over Seattle. He went out for a visit last week, left without signing a contract. The Seahawks are keeping the door open for the 2-time All-Pro selection to come back to Seattle and sign a contract. A veteran that's 33, 34 years old, like Geno Atkins, might want to wait until a week before week 1 and made sure that he could ensure himself that he didn't have to participate in training camp either. That's understandable. Players of that age, they just want to be able to get ready for games and rock and roll. You look at Seattle's depth chart, they've got Poona Ford, Al Woods, Brian Monet, but they don't really have another 3-tech option. You can reduce LJ Collier, Kerry Hyder, and Rasheem Green inside, but none of those players are natural defensive tackles. They can play passing downs inside, but you're not going to want to play them on early downs when teams are running the ball down your throat. Geno Atkins can still play that 3-tech position at a fairly high level, at least on a rotational role sense. And so I believe that Geno Atkins, there's still a very good chance that he is with the Seahawks. Might even wait till after week 1 when the Seahawks don't have to guarantee his salary. Both sides might agree to something at that point. But I think Geno Atkins finds his way to Seattle. They want to have another reliable 3-tech that can rotate in with Poona Ford. So that is a name to keep an eye on. And of course, they've got Robert Nkemdiche on the practice squad. If he can get healthy, that's another option they have that could play that 3-tech role and rotate in. But I think Geno Atkins is a player they want. I still think that the two sides are going to find a way to make this work. So we'll see if he reunites with Carlos Dunlap along Seattle's defensive line at some point early in the season. Coming up in the third quarter, I had a chance to chat with Brian Baldinger, analyst from NFL Network, to gauge his thoughts on Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, and the Seahawks going into the 2021 season. You won't want to miss this interview. I'll be right back. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Does this sound familiar? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream. It brings you live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes, no need to buy another device ever again, and the best part, there's no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directtv.com. That's directtv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. Did you know that Built Bar has 9 delicious flavors, plus an occasional limited time flavor? When you talk to a Built Bar fan like myself, we're definitely passionate about our favorite flavors. Just a few of them that you should try out: coconut, coconut almond, cherry, mint brownie, my personal favorite, peanut butter brownie, double chocolate, salted caramel. There's something for everyone. As I mentioned, peanut butter brownie is my favorite flavor, but I would devour any of those flavors. Sometimes I can't resist eating an entire box in one sitting, and I'm not afraid to admit it. If you haven't tried all the flavors, you can get a mixed box where you'll get 2 of each of the 9 flavors. Most of the flavors have 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and only 4 grams net carbs. 9 amazing flavors. They're all delicious, and they're all healthy. Order today and get that raspberry or mint brownie, whatever flavor you like. Go to BuiltBar.com and use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your first order. Use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Happy Wednesday to all of our listeners. Glad to have you tuning in. I had the opportunity to catch up with Brian Baldinger, former NFL player, now an analyst with NFL Network. You may know of his Baldy breakdowns. He is one of the top X's and O's experts out there. I have been watching his videos for years, long before I got into this business and I was covering the NFL for a living. When I was a teacher and I was a coach, I always loved to watch Baldy breakdowns. So really excited to have a chance to catch up with him and chat about Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, Jamal Adams, and a number of different Seahawks topics going into the 2021 season. Take a listen. Let's talk Russell Wilson here first, obviously. Got off to such a scintillating start last year. It felt like half his pass attempts were going for touchdowns. It was a pace that he wasn't going to keep up, but he cooled off. That was expected to an extent. Then he goes in the most prolonged slump of his career in the second half, and that offense was really struggling. What did you see from Wilson in those last couple months? How much of those struggles do you think were on him, and how much do you think was on Brian Schottenheimer as far as blame goes?
No, I don't know about the blame game here, Corbin. He started off, he threw 19 touchdown passes the first 5 weeks. The hashtag, let Russ cook, all that stuff. It was all real, and then he threw 7 interceptions in 3 of the next 4 games, and they lost games. And Pete was, Pete even said, I don't recognize this offense. And so, they had some injuries to running backs, and they couldn't run the ball quite like they wanted to, and all that kind of stuff. And they really only had 2 receivers they could go to, and the tight, there was just they were just limited. But they got back to Seattle football, and they won 6 of the last 7. They weren't good in the playoff game. But I think some of it is, I'm not speaking for Russell, but just as an outsider. I mean, he wants to be Aaron Rodgers. He wants to be Tom Brady for sure. I mean, he was there at the Super Bowl this year, sitting in the commissioner's box, watching Brady win his 7th. He knows one isn't going to put him in any elite company that he's won, even though he's been to 2 and probably should have won both. But, that's how he thinks. He wants to be remembered as one of the greatest. He's never missed a game in 9 years. He's played 16 postseason games. He understands what the whole thing is about. And he just thinks you got to throw it to win it. And I just think he's at odds with Pete. Now they can bring in Shane Waldron and maybe he'll marry, the 2 offenses together. But Pete wants to run it and pound it and take care of the football. And Russell wants to do what he did the first 5 weeks. So I don't know about blame. I just think that there's a difference in philosophy about how to win games.
Wilson was just so much more outspoken than we've ever seen him this offseason. Talking about getting hit too much, not being involved in personnel decisions. You mentioned going to the Super Bowl. I'm sure he was not happy seeing all the personnel involvement that Tom Brady has in Tampa Bay. But we heard all the trade rumors. I want to get your opinion on this because for me personally, I thought the offensive line last year was actually pretty solid. And there's a lot of analytics out there that suggest that really was the case. What did you see in the games when you watched that group in particular?
I thought they were pretty good too. I never really thought, when they were marching out for a long time, guys like, Jermaine or Fetty, like he was just, I'm not picking on Fetty, but they marched a lot of guys out there that weren't, I didn't think, quality guys, and then they just couldn't play together, and there were just too many breakdowns. They don't have any answer for Aaron Donald. They haven't. He's just been a wrecker of Seattle's offense. And I'm sure Russell has nightmares about seeing 99. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, Brandon Shell played good. Dwayne Brown has always been solid there. I think Damien Lewis is going to be a good football player. He's a better run blocker than he is probably a pass blocker at this point. Gabe Jackson's a really good player. Ethan Pochik is fine. They've made some changes along the line. I think they're pretty good, and so I think this is going to be as good a group as Russell has probably had in a while.
I want to talk specifically about Gabe Jackson because to me, I don't understand how the guy's never been a Pro Bowler based on the way that he's performed in his career, but somehow that's never happened, probably because he's played on a lot of really bad football teams, and it's difficult to make the Pro Bowl when you're not playing for winning teams. But just looking at his strengths and what he's done in his career to this point, how much does his arrival move the needle for this offense? Because that was really the only significant addition they made to that offensive line.
Well, Dwayne Brown's been the anchor since they traded for him, and he's been a good player, and it was a good move by John Schneider. But I do think the more good players you have up front, the better you're going to be. Gabe Jackson's a really good player. He's in the prime of his career right now. I don't know what year it is off the top of my head, for the Gabe, but he's been a really good player. He got paid. At one point, he was one of the highest paid guards in football. I forget which year it was, probably like 3-4 years ago. And it was a foundation piece. And when that group was healthy a couple of years ago, Josh Jacobs, they could run the ball against anybody. And Gabe was a big part of that. Rodney Hudson, him, Trent Brown. It was a good group. The guards are only as good, really, as the center and the tackle that they are sandwiched between. They got to play together with both those guys, in the run game and in the pass game. And sometimes you could be a really good guard, but if you're not playing well together with the guys next to you, it gets negated. And so really this offseason has been really important, for these guys to kind of build some chemistry and really kind of understand what Brandon wants to do, with how Ethan plays. It's going to be, it's going to be completely different now. One thing about Gabe, I don't know how many different right tackles he played next to in Oakland or Las Vegas. He probably played next to 4 or 5 different guys just off the top of my head. So, it'd be good to line up, next to the same guy, fingers crossed, for 17 games.
I want to look at the defensive side of the ball now real quick. This is a defense that I don't know if I'd ever seen a worse defense the first 7 or 8 games last year. They were on pace to just obliterate the Packers' record for passing yards given up. They have a lot of new pieces that weren't meshing. Then at the halfway point, we saw them start using more 5-2 fronts. They were mixing their coverages up more than I've ever seen with Pete Carroll. What differences did you see in how this defense played in the second half compared to what we've typically seen from Seahawk defenses? And what does that say about Pete Carroll's ability to adapt? Because I think a lot of people wrongfully believe that he just is kind of stuck in his ways on a lot of things. I thought he showed last year in defense that was not the case.
Well, I mean, Jamal Adams led him in sacks. I mean, Jamal Adams is not great in coverage. He's a better blitzer. You put him up against the back, he's going to win those matchups. He's just too powerful and strong. He comes too hard. So they figured out. I honestly thought they played a lot of. No, I don't have the stats in front of me. I thought they played a lot of 3 linebackers: KJ, Jordan Brooks, and then Bobby. And to be honest with you, I mean, I saw Bobby Wagner coaching Jordan Brooks during games and just like getting in his ear about certain things. And I think he was teaching him on the fly last year, which had to be, I knew eventually they would just move on from KJ and Jordan Brooks was going to be the guy because he looks like Bobby Wagner, plays like him. Like I don't know if he's ever going to be as good as Bobby, but it's the same school, Utah State. I mean, same coach, who coached him, and so the same coach at Texas Tech coached him, and coached Bobby at Utah State. I'm sorry, but anyways, they weren't good in coverage, but really their problem is they haven't find any pass rushes. That's been the biggest issue for anybody. I mean, in the secondary, I don't care who's playing corner. I mean, they're kind of rebuilding the secondary right now. But, I mean, really, pass rush has been their issue ever since, they lost a lot of the guys because they can't afford to pay them anymore because they're paying Russell Wilson top dollar. And you're not on a rookie deal anymore. You can't go out and get those kind of guys. Now, I like Kerry Hyder. I thought it was a good signing. I thought he was a good player in San Francisco last year. He played really, really hard. But, they haven't gotten anything from LJ yet. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to be that guy. Alton Robinson showed a little bit last year. Flash, like maybe that guy can do something. They traded for Carlos Dunlap and they kept him, and he got off to a good start. Benson Mayowa has always been a little bit solid. But they really don't have guys that can stream off the edge that can get there with 4. And so they had to blitz a lot more, I think, than they wanted to last year.
Yeah, that was really the key at the beginning of the season was they were just trying to stay afloat with blitzes. And then the second half, they actually weren't blitzing as much, and they were getting home a little bit more. You mentioned Kerry Hyder. I want to talk Adams just a little bit more here just because he just got this record-breaking deal. And there are a lot of football analysts out there, a lot of them that I respect, who really questioned the price tag. I'm not in that group, but there are a number of football analysts that question paying him $17.5 million per year to extend him. How did you see him get acclimated with this team, this defense, as his first year progressed? And do you think he's going to prove worthy of that type of money as he gets more comfortable playing here in Seattle?
Well, I mean, I'm a Jamal Adams fan, but, if you're going to be the highest paid, look, I mean, Joe Douglas moved from him in New York because Joe Douglas was around Ed Reed. You're seeing all these safeties go to the Hall of Fame, over the last couple of years, starting with Ed Reed and this guy. But you look at their numbers, Brian Dawkins, and you look at some of these guys, like they took the ball away. Like Jamal doesn't do that. Okay, sacks are nice. They're negative plays. But like these safeties that are going to the Hall of Fame are intercepting balls. Charles Woodson, when he was a safety, like they're scoring touchdowns, they're forcing fumbles. The one thing about Jamal that is just, I don't really understand because I know he can hit and likes to hit, and he's a big safety, but he doesn't even jar the ball loose. And so if you're not taking the ball away or causing turnovers, it's hard for a lot of these GMs to say, all right, do I have just a box safety here? Is that what he is? Can he really go match up with Travis Kelce or Darren Waller? I don't know that you want that matchup, and it's not really what they do anyways. But, if you want to, it'd be nice to have that option because that's what Tyrann Mathieu can do. Like he'll go match up with these tight ends like nobody, and he takes the ball away. And so, he's looking for a deal. But that to me as much as I like Jamal, and maybe this will happen now because the pressure's off of getting the deal. Like, he's been sitting there for 3 years thinking he's getting the deal. He finally gets it. Like, will he just go really play now and be happy? Because it didn't seem like he was ever happy. And, like, do this. Like, this is what safeties do. Great safeties cause turnovers. You know, I mean, you don't have to go very far, to look at the safeties that Seattle, had for, 7 or 8 years and how good they were at doing that. And so that, to me, is the reluctance of why you wouldn't pay a guy that kind of money.
That is a perfect segue to my last question here, because I think the most criminally underrated player on this Seahawks team is a guy that does know how to take the football away. And right now, he says it's not a hold-in, but, I mean, he's holding in the last week. And that's Quandre Diggs, a player that wasn't even listed on Pro Football Focus's top 32 safeties, which that just baffled me. But anyway,
yeah,
I want to know where your stance is as far as where Quandre Diggs stacks up in regard to other top safeties, because a lot of people are like, well, you just paid Adams, you can't pay Diggs, and yet this guy had 8 picks the last 2 years, one of only 5 safeties to do that, and every other player on that list played at least 6 games more than him. I mean, I just don't understand how this guy gets overlooked the way that he does.
I agree with you. I totally agree. And I know Pete feels that way about him. They gave up a lot for Jamal Adams, and so you can't give all that up for him and not sign him, even though, you'd like to share that money with Quandre, with somebody that really can, just the way that you can balance things out the way they once did with great Earl and, the guys they had back there. But I'm with you on Quandre Diggs, and I always like Marquise Blair too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you have to be able to play 3 safeties, and, maybe Ryan Neal's a solid player, but like, they've got 3 guys. You got to play 3. Now, they got away with playing 3 linebackers a lot last year because, they had 3 really good players there, and that kind of took them out of that game. But really, if you play Jordan Brooks and Bobby Wagner, you're probably going to play three safeties. One of them is going to be your cover safety, and your nickel and all that kind of stuff. So, I think they got some flexibility there, but I'm with you on Quandre Diggs, man. I think he's a really good player. They're lucky that I don't know what happened, exactly with Detroit and him, but I'm with you. I think Detroit is just one of those teams that just doesn't know how to value good players.
Betting on the NFL doesn't have to be a guessing game if you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's Lock of the Day. Follow the Locked On Bets podcast brought to you by betonline.ag. Wherever you get podcasts. You can follow me at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to check out the Locked On Seahawks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. Coming up on Thursday, I'll be rejoined by my co-host Rob Rang, and the two of us are going to be checking out the 2 waiver claims that the Seahawks made today, where those 2 players fit into Seattle's roster plans heading into Week 1. Plus updates on Quandre Diggs and Dwayne Brown as we edge closer to the season opener in Indianapolis. Thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.